It was 3:47 a.m. in Russia when radar screens lit up with something impossible. 4 unidentified objects raced toward Moscow, too small to track, too fast to stop. Within minutes, the sky over Ryazan burned orange, and 40% of Moscow's fuel supply vanished in a single explosion. But this wasn't luck, it was precision. Each move, each second, calculated to exploit every weakness in one of the most advanced air defense networks on Earth. You're about to see how modern warfare is being rewritten not by missiles or tanks, but by algorithms and machines no bigger than a suitcase. If you want clear, unbiased military analysis built on open-source intelligence and real data, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Now let's break down what really happened that night. It was 3:47 a.m. local time when a radar operator outside Ryazan noticed something strange. His S-400 display showed what looked like a flock of birds, except birds do not fly in perfect formation, and they certainly do not travel at nearly 380 kilometers per hour toward one of Russia's largest oil refineries. 4 unidentified objects were moving straight toward Moscow. They were small, fast, and invisible to one of the most advanced air defense networks on Earth. The operator hesitated. Nothing this size should have slipped past the radar screen. But the tracks were there, steady, closing fast. At 52 kilometers from the refinery, the lead Beaver drone suddenly climbed to 800 meters. That maneuver triggered a decision loop every air defense officer dreads. The system had only seconds to act. The intercept missile, a 48N6DM, could reach the target in 27 seconds. The drones, at emergency power, could enter the radar's 2-kilometer dead zone in 41 seconds. That left just 14 seconds for a decision fire or hold. Each interceptor cost $2 million. Standard training required positive identification before launch. 10 seconds. The commander hesitated. 7 seconds. His instincts overrode the manual. 5 seconds left. He ordered fire. 2 interceptors roared upward, accelerating to Mach 6 within 3 seconds, but the drones dove sharply to 200 meters, disappearing beneath the radar horizon. Now the missiles were blind. These models depend on semi-active radar homing. They need continuous illumination from the ground radar. Once contact is lost, the missile's onboard computer can only chase the last known coordinate. The operator watched in silence as both missiles detonated 80 meters above empty air. 24,000 steel fragments scattered harmlessly over farmland. The refinery's outer defenses now depended on 2 Pantsir S-1 systems, each designed for large targets. Against drones the size of a suitcase, their radar return barely rose above background noise. The crew saw flickering contacts, uncertain and intermittent. 17 seconds remained. 12 seconds. The guns tried to slew. 4 seconds. The first Beaver had already locked on target. At exactly 3:52 a.m. and 17 seconds, the first Beaver drone struck. Its warhead detonated inside the refinery's western processing sector, setting off a chain of explosions that tore through storage tanks filled with petroleum. 3 more drones arrived seconds apart, each one finding its mark with surgical precision. Within 90 seconds, 140,000 tons of fuel were burning at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius. The night sky over Ryazan turned orange. Flames climbed higher than the refinery's cooling towers, visible from more than 30 miles away. The loss was immediate and severe. Moscow's fuel supply was cut by 40% overnight. But the strike was not finished. 470 kilometers away, 12 more Ukrainian drones were already inbound, flying low and silent toward the Novokubishevsk refinery. This time, Russian commanders were confident they had prepared. 3 Pantsir S-1 batteries were positioned in triangular formation, overlapping their fields of fire. Each radar could track 20 targets and engage 4 simultaneously. For 11 minutes, they had tracked the incoming formation, confident this engagement would end differently. At 4:03 a.m., something unexpected occurred. 4 of the 12 drones abruptly climbed to 500 meters, exposing themselves to radar. Instantly, the system's automatic classification protocols screamed a priority alert. The radar signatures now matched those of Kh-101 cruise missiles. The radar operators did not know it, but each climbing drone had released a corner reflector, a small triangular device of aluminum that bounces radar signals directly back toward their source, amplifying their return. A 10-centimeter reflector can mimic a target the size of a fighter jet. The computers confirmed cruise missile threats. The lead battery commander had 2 seconds to decide. Doctrine was clear. Cruise missiles are always priority targets. He ordered immediate engagement. 8 57E6 interceptors fired in rapid sequence, each one accelerating to over 1,300 meters per second. From the radar's perspective, the threat multiplied. 4 became 8. 8 became 16. But what the radar was tracking was not a swarm of missiles, it was aluminum foil drifting in the wind. The missiles chased phantoms that cost less than a cup of coffee. While all eyes were fixed on the sky above the refinery, something worse was coming from behind. As the radar operators tracked the simulated cruise missiles, 8 UJ-22S slipped in from the opposite direction at roughly 50 meters altitude, about 164 feet, and closed to within 1.2 kilometers, roughly 3/4 of a mile. This was the fatal weakness of the Pantsir configuration. Its phased array can steer electronically left and right only so far. To look directly behind requires physically rotating a turret that weighs about 3,000 kilograms, more than 6,600 pounds. That rotation takes approximately 4.7 seconds. In a fight measured in single-digit seconds, 4.7 is an eternity. The order to traverse came too late. The drones were inside 1.2 kilometers before the arrays could bring guns and missiles to bear. The 57E6 missiles carried in the tubes needed roughly 1.5 seconds after launch to arm their proximity fuses. At that range, they would strike before arming. That left the twin 30mm cannons, the two A38M, as the last line. The guns opened up, each barrel fired at a cyclic rate of 2,500 rounds per minute. The fire control computer calculated the lead, projecting where the drone would be in 8 seconds when the rounds arrived. But the attackers had prepared for that. The UJ-22S executed what the Ukrainians called dynamic altitude variation. Random, 2-second changes in altitude between 40 and 80 meters, roughly 131 to 262 feet, using barometric altimeters to mask their pattern. Predictive tracking assumes continuity. Random rapid altitude shifts introduce process noise. Prediction becomes probability. The effective hit probability collapsed from 83% down to 31%. One drone was shredded in the gun stream 300 meters from the target, but 7 made it through. 3 of those struck the refinery, while the defensive system struggled to reorient. Worse for the defenders, the automatic reloader for the 57E6 missiles requires time. The tubes below the turret must eject spent launch canisters and chamber fresh missiles. That mechanical cycle takes about 90 seconds. 90 seconds of near-total vulnerability in which reloads and crew actions are visible and exposed. The Ukrainian planners had timed their waves to exploit exactly that window. As the guns burned out another cartridge and the missiles reloaded, 3 follow-on impacts found their marks. The defenders were proving a painful lesson. Layered systems can be defeated not by single technical fixes, but by timing, deception, and a ruthless exploitation of mechanical limits. At 4:18 a.m., 6 UJ-26 Beaver drones approached Voronezh. Then, almost simultaneously, they went blind. Their GPS signals vanished, telemetry cut off, and navigation screens filled with static. The culprit was a Krasuka 4 electronic warfare vehicle recently deployed to the area. This was not standard jamming. The Krasuka 4 floods the electromagnetic spectrum from 0.1 to 18 gigahertz with 500 watts of directed power. To understand the scale of that interference, GPS satellites transmit at roughly 25 thousandths of a watt from 20,000 kilometers above Earth. In practical terms, the jamming field was about 5 quadrillion times stronger than the satellite signal. The effect was like trying to whisper inside a running jet engine. The drone's GPS receivers were overwhelmed. Their onboard computers switched automatically to inertial navigation using gyroscopes. But inertial systems drift over time. After nearly 70 minutes of flight, roughly 380 kilometers covered their heading error could reach 10 degrees, translating to nearly 200 meters of positional uncertainty. At those distances, a miss would mean failure. Inside the drone's composite fuselage, the processor temperature climbed to 95 degrees Celsius. Thermal throttling engaged, slowing clock speed to prevent meltdown. Slower processing meant fewer pattern-matching cycles per second. To survive, the flight computer began emergency load shedding, shutting off non-essential systems. Navigation lights, off. Telemetry transmitters, off. Radar warning receiver, off. Each shutdown saved a few watts. Every watt reduced heat by a half degree. Every degree added 100 megahertz of speed. The drone had 30 seconds left to impact. Still no match on the refinery complex. At 20 seconds, the processor hit 98 degrees. At 10 seconds, thermal shutdown loomed. Then, at 8 seconds, the vision algorithm locked on a pattern, not the tanks themselves, but the geometric shadow they cast. 3 tanks formed a perfect triangle, their shadow lengths and angles matching a stored image reference. The drone corrected its course, identifying Tank 7 as the primary target, but the Krasuka's blanket jamming made radio communication impossible, unless the lead Beaver attempted something desperate. It initiated frequency-hopping spread-spectrum transmission, jumping through 1,000 channels per second in a pseudo-random sequence. For 1 microsecond, on channel 847, there was a gap. Through that brief hole in the noise, the drone transmitted 128 bytes of data, GPS coordinates, and impact timing. The remaining 5 drones received the fragment, parsed it through match filtering, and adjusted their trajectories. At 4:20 a.m., Tank 7 disappeared in a bloom of fire. The explosion ignited the fuel lake beneath, sending a wall of flame racing across the complex at roughly 30 meters per second. The Krasuka crew abandoned their vehicle and ran. As the electromagnetic haze cleared, Russian radar screens lit up again, revealing 8 more drones inbound on a far more heavily defended target. The next target was Primorsko-Akhtarsk, one of Russia's most fortified air bases. Its defenses were formidable. 4 Tor-M2 air defense vehicles deployed in a perfect diamond formation, each spaced 5 kilometers apart for complete overlapping coverage. 2 Su-35 fighters circled overhead at 8,000 meters, while every radar on base search, track, and fire control remained fully active. The commander of the base had studied every prior Ukrainian drone assault. His conclusion was simple: nothing would penetrate this layout. 8 drones against such a shield meant a guaranteed shoot-down, but as the first radar blips appeared on his screens, something in their movement did not make sense. The UJ-22 drones were not flying in straight lines. Instead, they weaved left, right, left again in a rhythmic pattern that wasted precious fuel. In military terms, this is known as a sinusoidal trajectory variation. Each lateral shift increased flight distance by 8%, burning an extra 4 liters of fuel per hour. It made no logical sense unless it was deliberate. The Tor-M2's fire control computer uses command guidance, predicting intercept points through a mathematical model known as a Kalman filter. This model assumes the target moves predictably, but the weaving introduced process noise, small deviations that compound over time. By the moment of missile launch, the accumulated targeting error could exceed 50 meters. At exactly 4:32 a.m., all 4 Tor-M2 systems fired. 16 9M338 missiles roared upward, accelerating to Mach 2.5 with solid rocket motors producing 4,000 kilograms of thrust. The engagement sequence was textbook: inertial guidance for the first 2 seconds, then command guidance until 2 kilometers from the target, switching finally to active radar for terminal homing. The engagement box formed an inescapable web. 10 seconds to impact. 9 seconds. The missile seekers activated. 8 seconds. The UJ-22S suddenly went vertical. Not a gradual climb, a 6G pull-up from 180 meters to 1,200 meters in just 4 seconds. The Tor missiles tried to follow, but their aerodynamic control canards stalled at 76 degrees of climb angle. The airflow separated. Control was lost. Thrust vectoring could compensate for only 12 degrees. The missiles sailed harmlessly beneath the rising drones. One proximity fuse did trigger, detecting an infrared signature overhead, the 400-degree exhaust of a climbing drone. The detonation scattered 3,500 tungsten cubes through the air, shredding 1 UJ-22 into fragments. But the other 7 continued unscathed. Every radar and every gun on the base was focused upward now, tracking the climb, calculating new firing solutions. No one noticed what was coming from the sea. 15 seconds later, 4 UJ-26 Beavers crossed the shoreline, flying barely 5 meters above the surface of the Sea of Azov. For more than 2 hours, they had used radar altimeters to hug the waves, constantly recalibrating to account for shifting reflections from the water's surface. The ocean route had left them invisible to land-based radar, which cannot detect beyond the horizon. Their targets were the Shahed drone storage hangars on the southern perimeter of the base, unguarded, unarmored, and packed with volatile fuel and munitions. At precisely 4:33 a.m., the first UJ-26 Beaver struck Hangar 2. The explosion did not just destroy the building, it lifted it. The roof launched upward like a manhole cover in a storm, reaching 50 meters before gravity pulled it back to Earth. 1.3 seconds later, Hangar 3 ignited, then Hangar 4. Within 45 seconds, the southern side of Primorsko-Akhtarsk base was an inferno. Inside those hangars had been more than 200 Shahed 136 drones, each carrying 40 kilograms of high explosive and 50 liters of fuel. In that confined space, the density of explosive material exceeded 30 kilograms per square meter, 10 times NATO's standard for ammunition storage. When the fireball consumed the depot, visibility on the runway dropped to 150 meters. The Su-35 seconds circling overhead could not land, and no aircraft could safely take off. The commander's radio log recorded a single sentence: "Base compromised, evacuating personnel." Russia's primary Shahed launch site was gone, yet even as the smoke spread across the Sea of Azov, 2 more Beavers were still in flight, hundreds of miles inland. Their destination, Penza, 630 kilometers inside Russian territory. The flight should have been impossible. The Beaver's standard range was roughly 350 kilometers. But these drones had been modified auxiliary fuel tanks installed in the warhead bay, sacrificing 5 kilograms of explosive payload for 12 liters of fuel. That change extended their range to nearly 980 kilometers, with a half hour of reserve. An Su-35 interceptor had already locked onto them, tracking for 20 minutes in narrow-beam radar mode at 20 kilowatts of power. At 43 miles, the pilot achieved a solid track. He fired 2 R-77 missiles, active radar homing weapons, each capable of tracking targets pulling up to 12 Gs. The first missile detonated 80 meters away, shredding 1 Beaver. The second hit directly, vaporizing the next. But one damaged drone continued flying. Its wing twisted, stabilizer gone, still running. The flight computer calculated it would miss the target by 40 meters. It diverted all remaining energy to a final thrust pulse, altering trajectory by 30 meters, enough to crash through the roof at 73 meters per second. The explosion was modest, 15 kilograms of explosive, but devastating in effect. This was no ordinary industrial building. It housed semiconductor fabrication lines producing military microprocessors. The clean room's air filtration system, built to trap particles smaller than 1/3 of a micron, was instantly overwhelmed by concrete dust. The electron beam lithography system, valued at $47 million, was destroyed. In a single impact, 6 months of Russia's military-grade processor output turned into silicon powder. Within hours, Russian command would order the largest air defense redeployment of the war. Systems pulled from refineries would leave gaps across the front. Those gaps would be exploited by Ukrainian HIMARS within days. Ukraine had spent $412,000 in drones to cause tens of millions in damage, but the real outcome was psychological. If drones could reach Penza, 630 kilometers from the border, then nowhere was beyond reach. War today is no longer defined by the size of an army or the range of a missile. It's defined by adaptation, by who learns faster, who calculates deeper, and who is willing to rewrite the rules mid-battle. In just a few hours, a handful of drones costing less than $500,000 forced one of the world's most sophisticated defense networks to rethink everything. The psychological impact may prove greater than the physical destruction. As analysts, we are watching a shift that will shape global military strategy for decades to come. If you found this breakdown valuable, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. It helps us continue delivering clear, data-driven military analysis, free from bias, built on open-source intelligence. Because the next battle for the sky may already be underway.